Before today's lecture, I'd like to mention my epic fantasy novel, Pragmatica Volume 1. You can read the completed second edition free, purchase a physical copy, or listen here on the channel to my full reading of the earlier manuscript as it went through editing. Everything is linked through the link tree below. Moving on to today's lecture, finally getting to the final book of Aristotle's Topics, Book 8. Now, Aristotle's Topics, Book 8 gives the practical method and discipline of dialectical exchange. You could very well say, okay, Topics, Book 8 is equivalent to, well, really the method and discipline of dialectical exchange. Book 8 teaches how to actually conduct a dialectical argument. The earlier books tell us where arguments come from. Book 8 tells us how to arrange them, ask them, discover them, well, answer them, repair them, criticize them, memorize them, and train with them. So, dialectic is the disciplined practice of questioning and answering. All right. Now let's go ahead and move on to the first point. From commonplaces to method. Now, books 2 through 7 gave the commonplaces for arguing about accident, genus, property, definition, and sameness. Book 8 asks, okay, how do we actually use these in live dialectical exchange? I mean, we've looked at a few examples, but this is a bit more rigorous. Now, or to the point of methodology. So, let me just write this down. Books 2 through 7. Where arguments come from mainly, though, you know, we did explore exactly how to argue from different positions. And then Book 8, how arguments are conducted. Book 8 turns dialectical theory into dialectical practice. Dialectic is not merely possession of topics, but skillful use of them. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. The 3 tasks of the questioner. Aristotle says the questioner must do 3 things. First of which, select the ground of attack. Whoops, I should change that notation. Oops. Select the ground of attack. The second, frame and arrange questions. Third, put the questions to the opponent. Right, so you have this proper way in which a questioner must do things: choose, arrange, ask. Right? Dialectic is not just finding arguments, it is arranging them for another mind. A dialectical argument must be strategically ordered. All right, let's go on to the next point. Philosopher and dialectician. So, the philosopher investigating alone wants premises that are true, familiar, and as close as possible to the matter under investigation. The dialectician must also think about the answer. A premise may be true and familiar, but if it lies too close to the conclusion, the answerer may refuse it because he sees where the argument is going. Philosopher to truth and explanatory nearness. Dialectician towards truth, acceptance, and strategy. The philosopher seeks the best premises, the dialectician seeks grantable premises. Dialectic adds strategy to logic. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Necessary and non-necessary premises. So, necessary premises are those through which the actual reasoning is constructed. You could say necessary premises are equivalent to premises that make the syllogism work. Other premises serve four purposes. Oops. Right. So either to secure a universal by induction, to lend weight to the argument, to conceal the conclusion, or to make the argument clearer, or some combination thereof. Right? Not every question is a premise of the final proof. Some questions prepare, support, conceal, or clarify. Questions may be logical, inductive, rhetorical, concealing, or clarifying. All right, let's go ahead to the next point. Let's go ahead and get to the next point. Okay. Do not ask directly for the necessary premise. Right, so the necessary premises should usually not be asked directly. If the questioner asks too plainly for the premise he needs, the answerer may see the conclusion and refuse. For example, instead of asking directly, is the knowledge of contraries one? Ask more broadly, is the knowledge of opposites one? then later argue contraries are a subset of opposites. In dialectic, a premise is easier to secure when the conclusion is not yet visible. Distance from the conclusion makes admission easier. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Securing necessary premises. A necessary premise may be secured by reasoning, induction, partly reasoning, and partly induction, and direct statement if too obvious to deny. The questioner adapts the route to the resistance of the answerer. Premises may be secured directly, inductively, or syllogistically. Let's go on to the next point. Induction moves from particulars to universal. So, induction proceeds from individual cases to the universal, and from the better known to the less known. Objects of perception are usually better known to most people. You have this, okay. Change this. You have this chain of particular cases to a universal premise. And this chain from the known to the less known or the unknown. from what you know to gauging a bit more about what you don't know. Now, induction builds agreement from familiar cases. Induction teaches the universal through the particular. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Concealment through prosyllogisms. To conceal one's plans, the questioner should secure the needed premises through earlier syllogisms rather than ask for them openly. Right, so you want to go from prosyllogisms to premises to your main syllogism. Right, a concealed argument hides the bridge until the hearer has already crossed it. Prosyllogisms can secure premises before their use becomes visible. All right, let's move on to the next point. Do not state intermediate conclusions too soon. So Aristotle recommends not stating the conclusions of preliminary syllogisms right away. Instead, draw them later, one after another. So, right, you have piece of 1, these are premises, premise. Piece of 2, piece of 3, these are secured quietly. Don't make a point of securing them and then celebrating once you get them or something like that. And then later, you show, okay, from conclusion 1, you get to conclusion 2, from conclusion 2, we get conclusion 3, right? So, so delay the visible conclusions until the structure is complete. Don't reveal the path before the admissions are secure. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Mix the order of questions. Don't ask all the premises for one conclusion together. Alternate between premises that support different parts of the argument. Right, so a bad order would be something like, okay, ace of 1, ace of 2, ace of 3, right? Going to deal with the conclusion there, and a better concealing order, like if these were all of the same premise type, and you just, you know, just went one after another, not really. Well, this sort of depends on like the extension, but just say that that was it, right? Versus ace of 1, b sub 1, ace of 2, c sub 1, b sub 2, ace of 3. It's a lot harder to deal with that. Arrangement can hide inference, right? So that they wouldn't just outright, flatly deny it from the get-go. You could build up a case, a much more thorough case, without them really, I guess, immediately putting the blinders on is, I think, probably the best way of saying it. So, question, order, manages visibility, because that is a thing that I have noticed. It's different debates, just in the ordinary way of things. Because if you just go all in on one conclusion all at once, and you don't like bring up different sorts of cases, can really such individuals might put their blinders onto the argument and just dismiss it outright without even considering other points. You know, sad reality of our world, but that's just the way it is. Now, let's go ahead and move on to, I mean, it's not exactly sad. It's a double-edged sword, as a lot of other things are. But anyways, this next point, secure universals through coordinates. So, a universal premise may be secured through a coordinate term rather than through the exact term needed. For example, if one needs something about the angry man, like if you want to say something about the angry man in general, secure the definition, secure a definition of anger. Right, and you could say something like, anger is equivalent to desire for vengeance because of apparent slight. And the claim about the angry man follows. Yes, so definitions and coordinates can secure universals indirectly. Let's see, do I have enough room to write this? I think so. The coordinate term may be less suspicious than the target term as well. Cutting it close. So it's kind of like, well, if you can sink your claws in there with a coordinate term, maybe you can have something a bit stronger than well, just going after the universal premise a bit more bluntly, I guess, is a way of putting it. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Like, as you can see, like, all of these, a lot of these points are basically about having tact in argument. You know, it's like, well, a theory of a bunch of different tactics is like, that's strategy, and that's exactly what this book is about. But this next point is make the proposition or something which reveals tactics along the way. Like in chess, how if you have a solid position, tactics will be more readily available is the theory. But yes, make the proposition seem to serve another purpose. Yeah, I'd say like this is definitely like of all the books in the Organon, this is the Weasleyiest, you could say. It's very Weasley in a way. I mean, but like it's more just about like precision and tact and really being a scalpel in arguments over, you know, a hammer, so to speak. Because I mean, if it were so that you could just like put your hand on somebody's head and transfer all of the information you have about all of the arguments, and everything that you find to support it, and them likewise, that would be nice, but such is not the case. So, well, going back to this point, make the proposition seem to serve another purpose. The questioner should sometimes formulate a premise as though it is being asked for some other reason. People resist granting what they see the opponent needs, right? So So if a premise is needed for a conclusion, make it appear illustrative. I guess sort of the next book which we go after is On Sophistical Refutations, and it's like the anti-Weaseling book, I guess. But I mean, it all sort of is. This is about like pinning down. I mean, if you've gone through the lectures or read through the books here, or some combination thereof, that's what you'll see. But yes, if a premise is needed for a conclusion, make it appear illustrative. Now, a premise is more easily granted when it doesn't look decisive, right? So, a hidden purpose often meets less resistance. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. The next point, leave your aim doubtful. The questioner should leave it uncertain whether he wants the proposition or its opposite. If the answerer doesn't know which admission helps the questioner, he is more likely to answer according to what he actually thinks. Right, so uncertainty about the questioner's aim can produce more honest answers. When the strategic direction is unclear, the answer is less guarded. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Use likeness. Admissions can be secured through likeness. right? A corresponds with B. It's equivalent to C corresponding with D. So sort of seeing this for analogies. And for example, suppose you have a statement, knowledge of contraries is 1. Well, this can be supported by comparison. With perception of contraries is 1. Right, this resembles induction, but it's not exactly induction. Induction secures a universal from particulars. Likeness secures a parallel case. Likeness helps transfer plausibility from one case to another. Arguments from likeness are parallel and not purely inductive. All right, let's move on to the next point. Occasionally object against yourself. It can be useful to raise an objection against oneself. Answers are put off guard by someone who appears impartial. Right, so self-objection can make the questioner seem fair and reduce resistance. Appearing impartial can make dialectical question more effective. All right, let's go ahead to the next point. Appeal to what is commonly said. Right? It's useful to add lines like this is generally held or this is commonly said because people are reluctant to overturn received opinion unless they have a strong objection. And doxa exerts social and dialectical pressure, right? So common opinion supplies dialectical weight. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Do not be too insistent. Insistence arouses suspicion. If a questioner presses too hard on one point, the answer realizes the point matters and becomes resistant. Excessive pressure reveals strategic importance. The more visibly you need a premise, the harder it may be to secure. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Let's see here. Put the most desired point last. All right, so one should often put last the point which one wants, the one which one, okay, so one should often put last the point one most wants conceded. People are especially inclined to deny the first questions because they expect the questioner to ask first for what he wants most. Right, so minor points first. Crucial point later. Now, question order manages suspicion, right? So the crucial premise is often safest. After lesser admissions. You all could probably see this in some of the debates you all experience. Like, you'll see this thing where somebody goes like, oh, yes, that makes sense. Oh, yes, that makes sense. Oh, yes, that makes sense. And oh, okay, I was unsure about that next thing that you're saying, but been agreeing up. I've been agreeing so far, so I'm more inclined to agree now, versus like you say the most outrageous or the most desired point at the beginning, and everybody is definitely not. They're not conditioned to it, I guess you could say. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. adapt to the answerer. Right, so some answerers admit most readily what comes first, especially if they are ill-tempered or overconfident. So with some people, the important proposition should be asked early, right? So it's like, okay, it's like the opposite of the previous case. But, yeah. You just kind of have to gauge it. But, that's it. I think that's all I have to say about that. But yes, so with some people, though I don't imagine it's as common as the previous thing. So, but that's why it's adapt. Right? Dialectical method depends on the character of the answerer. There is no strategy without attention to the person answering. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Complexity can conceal weakness. Some questioners expand the argument and insert unnecessary material, like people who draw false geometrical figures, or, statistical ones. But in the multitude of details, the fallacy is obscured, right? So many details lead to harder to see the decisive point, right? It's like how some World War II tanks used to have smokers at the back, put out a bunch of smoke. It's hard to see exactly where the tank is with all of that material up in the air. So complexity can conceal weakness. A crowded argument can hide a false step. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Ornament and clearness. Non-necessary premises can also serve ornament and clearness. Ornament is achieved by induction and by distinguishing closely related things. Clearness is achieved by examples and comparisons drawn from familiar method. So we have ornament through induction and distinctions, clearness, through examples and comparisons. And you can see this with like well, the word ornament, like a Christmas tree ornament, different things you're putting onto the tree you're building up. Clearness, of course, that makes more sense because you're, you know, if you have a foggy lens, you know, you can clear it up. In this case, with adding more examples and comparisons. I mean, you couldn't exactly do that with a with an actual lens, but I mean, to make clear of a thing, to show more examples of a thing, to show what a thing ahead of you might be, examples and comparisons are very valuable. So, good dialectic must not only interfere, must also appear orderly and intelligible. Argument needs both force and presentation. What separates a villain from a supervillain? Presentation. Like that movie. Okay. Anyhow, this next point, syllogism for dialecticians. Induction for the crowd. Now, syllogism should be used especially against dialecticians. Induction is mostly useful against the crowd, right? So you have an expert in the case. The tool of the trade would be a syllogism. For a crowd, induction might be an easier thing, at least in Aristotle's estimation here. So the form of argument should fit the audience, right? Different hearers are moved by different forms of reasoning. And we saw this earlier, and we see this in day-to-day life. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Coin a general term when an induction needs one. So, sometimes induction needs a universal term, but no established term covers all the similar cases. In that case, one should coin a term or phrase to cover all cases of a specific sort. Right, so induction leads to a need for a universal term that doesn't exist. Invent one, right? Invent that catch-all term, that universal term, that uniterm, that catches all cases of this sort. A good dialectician gives a name to the common feature under induction. Name the common kind so the cases can be gathered into one. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Demand objections only after giving cases. Right, so if the questioner has made an induction from several cases and the answer refuses the universal, the questioner may fairly demand an objection. But first, the questioner must actually provide the cases, right? So first, cases, then demand counterexample. So the burden to object arises after the induction has been supplied. Cases first, objection second. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Objections should not exploit homonymy. Sounds like you're stuttering a lot whenever you say harmony, but homonymy. So, we've talked about this at length before, but sometimes people object by using a homonym, right? So, for example, a person may have a foot that is not his own, as a cook may have a foot of an animal. This doesn't refute the claim that a man cannot have a foot other than his own in the relevant sense. So a valid objection must attack the intended meaning, not a homonym. Right? Equivocation is not a real counterexample. All right. Let's move on to the next point. Though, perhaps I should pronounce it equivocation rather than equivocation. Anyhow, on to the next point. Withdraw. Oops. Withdraw the objectionable part and save the universal. So, if objection hits only part of a universal statement, then withdraw that part and restate the remainder. For example, people may object to whoever has lost knowledge has forgotten. Because knowledge may be lost if the object changes. So, revise. Whoever has lost knowledge of a thing, while the thing remains as forgotten. All right. I just erase this to make some more room. Well, actually, do I have to? I don't think so. No. Okay. So, a good questioner repairs universals by removing the counterexample. Refine the universal until the objection no longer applies. All right, on to the next point. For this next point, we have dialectical premises after induction. So, if the questioner gives many cases and the answer has no objection, the answerer should grant the universal. A dialectical premise is valid when it holds in several cases and no objection appears. Right, so you have many cases, plus no objection. All right, and this is from the questioner. Grant universal from the answerer. All right. So in dialectic, an undefeated induction earns provisional acceptance without a counterexample. Repeated cases have dialectical force. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Avoid reductio when possible. So, in demonstration, it may not matter whether one argues directly or by reductio ad impossibile. But in dialectical debate, reductio should be avoided when possible. Well, why is that? Well, because people may deny that the supposed impossibility is really impossible, right? So you run into that difficulty, and it creates a whole thing that you have to work with in tandem. So So direct argument is less disputable than reductio in live debate. So when possible, prove directly rather than through an alleged impossibility. All right, let's move on to the next point. Do not put the conclusion as a question. So, the conclusion shouldn't be asked as a question, and the reason why is, well, if the questioner asks, okay, so is the conclusion true, and the answerer denies it, it may appear as if the reasoning has failed. Instead, the conclusion should be stated as what follows from the admissions, right? So don't ask permission for the conclusion, draw it, right? So the conclusion is to be inferred, not requested. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Dialectical questions must be answerable by yes or no. So not every question is a dialectical proposition, right? Questions like, what is man? Or how many meanings has the good? Cannot be answered by yes or no. A dialectical question must be framed so the answer can grant or deny. Right, so if you have a dialectical premise, right, it implies a yes or no form. Dialectic needs questions shaped as propositions. Turn open questions into grantable or deniable claims. Let's move on to the next point. Avoid asking one thing too long. Right, so a questioner who keeps asking one thing for too long is bad at inquiry. If the answerer keeps answering, the questioner is either asking too many questions or repeating the same question. If the answerer refuses to answer, the questioner should take him to task or end the discussion. Right, so just straight this. Right, so good dialectic is concise and progressive. It builds upon itself. So reasoning should move forward through a small number of premises. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Difficult problems often need definition. So some hypotheses are hard to attack and easy to defend, right? That's the nature of the beast. Now, especially things near first principles or final conclusion. So when a problem becomes intractable, it often needs definition, distinction of senses, intermediate premises. So problem becomes intractable needs definition, distinction of senses, and or intermediate premises. All right, now when argument stalls, define, distinguish, or supply the missing middle. Difficulty often reveals the need for clarification. Go ahead and move on to the next point. First principles are hard to argue about. Don't I know it? Now, first principles, yeah, they can't be proved by anything prior. They must be understood through definition. Yeah, first principles are like one of those things where I'd say it's probably like if you're ever debating someone, I don't know if you notice this, but in my particular experience, they're like the one thing that if you go all out on those, they get blinders real fast. But but anyways, first principle, right? You don't want to have this come from prior proof. I mean, within Aristotle's framework, that's his way of addressing it. Now, first principle instead needs definition. Right? So, at the foundations, dialectic depends on definition rather than proof. So, well, I mean, that makes sense, right? It's foundational, so what is prior to the foundations, right? So now, first principles, I guess the ground now. But yeah, so first principles are clarified not demonstrated from prior principles. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Obscure terms make argument impossible. Right, the hardest definition to use terms where it's unclear whether they're univocal or ambiguous, literal or metaphorical. If one cannot tell which, argument becomes nearly impossible. Right, I guess there's a case where it's like, let me just waddle through the mud and we'll get somewhere, I guess is I add nearly onto that. So, obscurity blocks refutation because the target keeps shifting, right? So no stable meaning, no stable argument. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Hard problems reveal hidden defects. So whenever a position is hard to discuss, one of several things is usually true. Oh, this, it needs definition. It's one case. It has several senses. Or maybe it's metaphorical. or it lies near first principles, or missing intermediate positions, well, premises haven't been found. Right, so difficulty in argument is often a diagnostic sign. An intractable problem usually needs definition, distinction, or mediation. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. The answerer's task. So Aristotle now turns from the questioner to the answerer. The questioner's task is to make the answerer utter paradoxes that follow from his position. The answerer's task is to make clear that any absurdity belongs to the position, not to his way of defending it. So for the questioner, you want to draw out consequences. Oops. Maybe I should capitalize both of those. For the answerer, you want to defend the position properly. Right? The questioner attacks the thesis. The questioner must not add unnecessary weakness to it. The answerer must distinguish the weakness of the thesis from poor defense. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. All right, this next point is training, teaching, competition, and inquiry differ. right? So Aristotle distinguishes several settings. Right, so there's teaching and learning, training and examination, competition, and serious inquiry. Right, so a learner should say what he thinks because the teacher is not trying to teach him falsehood, or at least you'd hope not. A competitor aims at appearing successful. An inquirer aims at truth and testing. The rules of answer depend on the purpose of exchange. Different settings require different dialectical conduct. All right, let's move on to the next point. This point is the answerer must judge what to grant. Right, so the answerer's thesis may be generally accepted, generally rejected, neither accepted, nor rejected. And it may be absolutely accepted, or absolutely rejected. Right? It may also be accepted or rejected absolutely by the answer, or some definite person whose view he is defending. So the answer grants or refuses premises relative to the thesis being defended. Granting is governed by the standpoint of the defense. All right, let's move on to the next point. If defending a rejected thesis. So if the answer defends a thesis generally accepted, while generally rejected, the questioner's intended conclusion will usually be generally accepted. Therefore, the answer should not grant premises that are less accepted than the conclusion. Rejected thesis implies accepted opposing conclusion. Do not defend an unpopular thesis by granting even less credible premises. A weak thesis cannot be defended by weaker premises. Let's move on to the next point. If defending an accepted thesis, so if the answer defends a generally accepted thesis, the questioner's conclusion will be generally rejected. Therefore, the answer may grant generally accepted premises and even some that are less rejected than the conclusion. Right, so a popular thesis can withstand premises less secure than itself if they are still better than the opposing conclusion. Measure premises against the conclusion being forced. All right, let's move on to the next point. If defending someone else's opinion. Right, so if the answer is defending another person's view, he should answer according to that person's principles, right? So be representative of said person. right? And for example, if defending Heraclitus, refuse premises Heraclitus would refuse. Even if one doesn't personally believe the view. The answer must defend from within the position he has undertaken. To defend a doctrine, speak from its principles. All right, let's move on to the next point. How to answer irrelevant questions. So if the question is irrelevant and generally accepted, grant it and say that it's accepted. Right? If it's irrelevant and not generally accepted, grant it, but note that it's not generally accepted, so one does not seem foolish, right? So it's accepted. All right. Now, irrelevant questions may be granted, but their status should be marked. Grant irrelevant premises without letting them define your position. All right, let's move on to the next point. How to answer relevant questions. Right? If the question is relevant and generally accepted, the answer may admit that it is accepted, but should warn that it lies too close to the original thesis and would collapse the problem. If the question is relevant but absurd or too rejected, the answer should refuse it. Right? Relevant questions require caution because they may carry the whole conclusion. The closer a premise is to the thesis, the more carefully it must be handled. All right, let's move on to the next point. Answering obscure or ambiguous questions. Right, so if the answer does not understand the question, he may simply say, I don't understand, right? So right, he's not forced to answer yes or no to a question with several meanings. If the question is partly true and partly false, the answer should distinguish the senses immediately. Right, so I don't want to say flesh it out as in get rid of it, but more just clarify. So never grant an ambiguous question without distinguishing the sense. Ambiguity should be answered by distinction, not blind assent. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Simple questions require yes or no. If the question is clear and simple, the answerer should answer yes or no. Clear plus simple question implies yes or no. Distinguish ambiguity, but don't dodge clarity. A clear dialectical question deserves a clear answer. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Particulars and universals in answering. So particular propositions should be admitted if they are true and generally held. Against universals, the answer should try to bring a negative instance. Right? A counterexample is the proper answer to a doubtful universal. Deny universals by producing cases where they fail. And if it's a particular claim, admit it if it's true and generally held. If not, then you'll have to go a whole step further in the case if in the case in which it's not. So yeah, deny universals by producing cases where they fail. All right, on to the next point. Ill temper in argument. If someone refuses a universal supported by many cases and has no counterexample or counterargument, Aristotle calls this ill temper in argument. So you have universal with many cases plus no objection plus refusal equals ill temper. Dialectical resistance must be reasoned, not merely stubborn. A refusal without reason is not good answering. On to the next point. Examine your own thesis first. Before defending a thesis or definition, the answerer should try attacking it himself. This prepares him for the questioner's likely lines of attack. Right? The best answer has already been his own opponent. So, self-criticism is preparation for defense. Let's move on to the next point. Avoid hateful or morally ugly theses. Now, Aristotle warns against maintaining theses that are generally rejected in a morally ugly way. Right, so for example, you have 2 points here. One is pleasure is the good. And you have another point, doing injustice is better than suffering it. Right? People may hate the answer because they think he believes the position personally, not merely for the argument. Some theses damage the speaker's character in the eyes of the audience. Dialectical positions can have ethical and reputational consequences. Oops, it's a little off screen there. Okay. Let's move on to the next point. Solving a fallacious argument. To solve a false argument, one must demolish the point on which the fallacy depends. It's not enough to attack any false premise at random. For instance, if you had this pattern, if you had this argument, he who sits writes, Socrates sits, therefore Socrates writes. The problem isn't Socrates sits, it's he who sits writes. A real solution attacks the cause of the fallacy. Don't merely deny something false, deny the falsehood that makes the argument work. Go ahead and move on to the next point. Four ways to stop an argument. Aristotle lists 4 ways to prevent an argument from reaching its conclusion. The first of which is demolish the point on which the falsehood depends. The second, object against the questioner. Third, object against the questions. Fourth, object by appealing to the time allowed. Right? Only the first is a true solution. The rest are hindrances. Not every way of stopping an argument is a solution of it. A solution removes fallacy. A hindrance merely blocks its progress. Let's go on to the next point. Criticizing an argument versus criticizing the questioner. Criticizing the argument itself differs from criticizing the questioner's conduct. Sometimes an argument looks bad because the answer refused obvious premises or became abusive. Then the fault may lie with the discussion, not the argument considered by itself. An argument's logical quality and a debate's conduct are different matters. Bad discussion can obscure good argument. Let's move on to the next point. Dialectic is not mere contest. Right, in genuine dialectic, questioner and answer share a common aim, that is examination. In contest, only one person can win. Dialectic degenerates when the common aim is replaced by the desire not to lose. True dialectic is cooperative examination, not mere victory. On to the next point. Five criticisms of arguments. Aristotle gives 5 kinds of adverse criticism against an argument, the first of which is, well, no conclusion follows. Second, the conclusion is relevant to the original thesis. Third, needed additions would be weaker than the conclusion. Unnecessary premises have been concluded. It's fourth. Fifth, premises are less credible. Or harder to prove than the conclusion. Arguments can fail by invalidity, irrelevance, weakness, excess, or poor premise. Quality. A bad argument may fail in form, aim, economy, or credibility. All right, on to the next point. Evaluate arguments in themselves and relative to the thesis. An argument may be bad in itself, but good relative to the difficulty of the thesis. Or it may be good in itself, but bad relative to the thesis. Goodness, if much better arguments were available. Right, these are different sorts of scenarios. Arguments are judged both absolutely and relative to the task. A fair criticism asks both, is the argument good? And is it good enough to be, well, is it good enough here? All right, let's move on to the next point. Types of inference. We brushed a little bit on these before, but Aristotle gives names for different kinds of inference. One is philosopheme. So this is equivalent to demonstrative demonstrative inference. Epikyreme is equivalent to dialectical inference. Sophism is equivalent to contentious inference. Aporeme is equivalent to dialectical inference to contradiction. Arguments differ not only by form, but by purpose and standards. The kind of inference depends on the kind of inquiry. Move on to the next point. Clear and fallacious arguments. An argument is clear if it reaches a conclusion in a way that needs no further questions, or if the necessary premises compel the conclusion. An argument is fallacious in several ways. For one, it only appears to conclude it concludes but not to the proposed conclusion. It uses the wrong mode of inquiry. Or it concludes from false premises. An argument can fail by appearance, irrelevance, wrong discipline, or false grounds. A fallacy may lie in form, target, method, or premises. Go ahead and move on to the next point. Begging the original question. One second. Aristotle gives 5 ways someone may beg the question. First of which is begging the exact conclusion. Second, begging universally what must be shown particularly. Begging particularly what must be shown universally. Begging the conclusion piecemeal. Begging one of 2 mutually entailing claims. Begging the question means smuggling the conclusion into the premises. A proof fails if it answers what it was supposed to prove. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Begging contraries. The ways of assuming contraries correspond to the ways of begging the question. A person may assume opposite, affirmation and negation, contrary terms, a universal and its contradictory particular, or premises that imply the opposite of the intended conclusion. Contradiction in the premises is a different fault from circularity about the conclusion. Begging the question concerns the conclusion, assuming contraries concerns the premises. Let's go on to the next point. Training by conversion. Aristotle recommends practicing by converting arguments. To convert an argument, take the opposite of the conclusion together with the remaining premises and use them to demolish one of the conceded premises. All right, so piece of 1, piece of 2, these are premises to conclusion. Convert You have not the conclusion and a premise implying not another premise. Right? So conversion trains both attack and defense. To know an argument, to know an argument well is to know how it reverses. Let's move on to the next point. Always look for arguments pro and con. For every proposition, look for arguments both for and against it. Dialectical skill requires seeing both sides at once. The trained dialectician can argue and answer from either side. Let's move on to the next point. Touched on this one a bit, but argue with yourself. Right? So if one cannot find someone else to argue with, one should argue with oneself. Dialectical training can become internal discipline. The mind can become its own questioner and answerer. All right, let's move on to the next point. Arrange arguments on the same thesis side by side. Collect arguments relating to the same thesis and place them together. This gives one a stock of arguments for attacking and, for attack and defense. Argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, and something that's not. Organized memory strengthens dialectical readiness. Arguments become more useful when grouped by thesis. On to the next point. Memorize common arguments and definitions. Aristotle recommends knowing by heart arguments on frequent questions and especially on ultimate propositions. He also recommends keeping a stock of definitions of familiar and primary ideas. Dialectical skill depends on ready possession of definitions and first principles. So the dialectician must have definitions at his fingertips. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Classify premises like loci. Aristotle compares dialectical memory to remembering through places or loci. If premises are classified under heads, they can be retrieved more quickly. The trained dialectician stores arguments under organized headings. Memory becomes powerful when premises are arranged by topic. Let's move on to the next point. Memorize general premises more than whole arguments. better to commit to memory a premise of general application than a whole argument. Well, why? A general premise can generate many arguments. One universal premise could lead to many arguments. General principles are more reusable than particular arguments. Memorize what can be adapted. Let's move on to the next point. Turn one argument into many. The dialectician should practice turning one argument into several. This is easiest with universal arguments because they apply across many cases. A powerful argument is one that can be adapted. Dialectical mastery multiplies arguments from a single pattern. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Record discussions universally. Even if one argued a particular case, record the result in universal form. This allows a single discussion to become a reusable rule. So from a particular debate, you can have a universalizing or universal record. Training turns episodes into principles. The useful memory of a debate is the general form it reveals. On to the next point. Avoid universalizing the actual argument. For one's training, record arguments universally, but in actual argument, avoid universalizing too openly when doing so makes the inference too obvious. Universal form is best for study, but particular form may be better for conducting the exchange. All right, so study universally. Question strategically. On to the next point. Display induction to the young, deduction to experts. Aristotle recommends displaying inductive reasoning against a young person and deductive reasoning against an expert, right? So young learner, lean into induction, expert, lean into deduction. Dialectical teaching should match the hearer's training. The same truth may require different routes for different hearers. Let's move on to the next point. Take something away from every exercise. From every exercise in argumentation, one should take away something, right? Whether it be a syllogism, a refutation, a proposition, an objection, a lesson about good or bad questioning, every argument should become material for a future skill. Practice is wasted unless it leaves behind a reasonable tool. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Proposition and objection. Aristotle gives a beautiful final distinction between these two. To formulate a proposition is to make many things into one. To formulate an objection is to make one thing into many. The questioner unifies, the objector distinguishes. Dialectic moves between gathering and dividing. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Do not argue with everyone. Aristotle ends with practical advice. Don't argue with every person or practice on random people. Some people will use any means to avoid seeming defeated, and the discussion will degenerate into contentious argument. Dialectic requires a suitable partner. Argument is only fruitful with someone willing to share the work of inquiry. Let's move on to the next point. These will be some of the closing points. The architecture of Book 8. So, Book 8 moves through the following arc. You go from commonplaces to method, and from that to task of the questioner, from that to necessary and supporting premises, from that to concealment and order, then from concealment and order to induction, likeness, examples, then from that to yes or no dialectical questions, and from that to hard problems and definition, then from that to answerer's task, and from that to what to grant and refuse, from that to ambiguity, from ambiguity to objections and solutions, from objections and solutions to criticisms of arguments, from criticism of arguments to clear, fallacious, dialectical, contentious arguments, and from that to begging the question, from begging the question to the conversion and training, from conversion and training to memory, definitions, loci, and from that to proposition and objection, from proposition and objection to choosing suitable partners. Book 8 is Aristotle's handbook for live argument. The earlier books supply the tools. Book 8 teaches their use. On to the next point. Summary of main ideas. Book 8 turns from the sources of arguments to the conduct of dialectical exchange. The questioner, first, we start out with the questioner must select the ground of attack, arrange the questions, and put them to the opponent. The philosopher seeks premises nearest to truth. The dialectician must also seek premises that the answerer will grant. Necessary premises produce the reasoning itself. Other premises support induction, weight, concealment, or clarity. Necessary premises should often be secured indirectly. Induction proceeds from particulars to universals, and from what is better known to what is less known. Concealment is achieved through prosyllogisms, delayed conclusions, and mixed order. Likeness transfers plausibility from one case to another. Self-objection appeals to common opinion. Restraint and careful order can reduce resistance. The important premise is often best asked late, though the method must adapt to the answerer. Syllogism is best for dialecticians. Induction is best for the crowd. If induction has been supplied and no counterexample appears, the universal should be granted. Reductio is less useful in live debate when the alleged impossibility can be disputed. The conclusion should be drawn and not asked as a question Dialectical questions must be answerable by yes or no. Difficult problems usually require definition, distinction, or missing intermediate premises. First principles are clarified by definition, not proved from prior principles. The answer must defend the thesis without adding unnecessary weaknesses to it. Teaching, training, competition, and inquiry require different kinds of answering. The answer should grant or refuse premises according to the thesis being defended and the standards relevant to it. Ambiguous questions should be answered by distinguishing the senses. Clear and simple questions should receive clear yes or no answers. A counterexample is the proper answer to a doubtful universal. Refusal without counterexample or counterargument is ill temper in argument. The answer should attack his own thesis before defending it. Some theses are morally ugly or reputationally dangerous to defend. A real solution to a fallacy attacks the point on which the fallacy depends. Not every way of stopping an argument is a true solution. Arguments may be criticized in themselves or relative to the thesis and the conduct of the discussion. Genuine dialectic differs from mere contest because it has a shared aim of examination. Arguments can fail by Arguments can fail by invalidity, irrelevance, weakness, excess, or bad premise quality. A philosopheme is demonstrative. An epicurene is dialectical. A sophism is contentious, and an apparene reasons dialectically to a contradiction. Begging the question smuggles the conclusion into the premises. Assuming contraries differs from begging the question because it is a fault in the relation among the premises. Conversion trains both asking and answering. The dialectician should look for arguments both for and against every proposition. One may train by arguing with oneself. Arguments should be grouped by thesis and stored under organized heads. General premises are more reusable than particular arguments. Record discussions universally, even when the actual debate concerned a particular case. Use induction with the young and deduction with experts. Take from every exercise a syllogism, refutation, proposition, objection, or lesson about questioning. A proposition makes many things into one. An objection makes one thing into many. Don't argue with everyone. Dialectic requires a suitable partner. So, in the final framing of this topics, Book 8 teaches the practical discipline of dialectical questioning, answering, criticism, and training. Book 8 is Aristotle's handbook for live argument. The earlier books tell us where arguments come from. Book 8 tells us how to arrange them, ask them, answer them, repair them, criticize them, memorize them, and train with them. Dialectic is not only a storehouse of commonplaces, it is a disciplined practice of questioning and answering ordered toward examination. Dialectic is logic trained for conversation. And that is it for this lecture. I will see you in the next one.